gentlemen, we have some good news for you. We're not talking about escalation of conflict. In fact, we are talking about a trade deal that's going to be signed between the United States and China. Is going to be signed in Washington, D.C. In news coming in, there is a delegation that is going to be going to the United States to be signing the first phase of that trade pact. Joining me to talk about this on the implications for the larger economy and India is Alastair Newton as well as Michael Kugelman. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us on the India Development Debate. I'm Nantara Rai. Alastair, I'm coming to you first. It's so good to talk about some good news when it comes to geopolitics. This is along expected lines. Can you put it in context for us? How big is this? What is it really going to mean for global trade?
It's probably not going to mean a great deal for global trade at all. In fact, in my view, it's a deal which Donald Trump could have had nearly 2 years ago. It is not the world's greatest deal as he is making it out to be. However, we also have to put it against what the seeming alternative was. And the seeming alternative was some very tough tariffs indeed, which would otherwise have come in on the 15th of December. Plus, of course, the full tariffs from the 1st of September rather than the reduced versions, which we now have. So if we look at the agreement as it stands against what was likely to happen in the absence of an agreement, clearly global trade is in a better place, the global economy is in a better place, and in that respect, this fairly minimal deal in all other respects is not to be dismissed, and we have, to all intents and purposes, hopefully put to one side for the foreseeable future, at least, by which I mean from now through until the 3rd of November general election in the US, what was, for the last 18 months or so, the biggest single concern of a geopolitical nature, as opposed to central banks and so on, weighing on financial markets. So I would say that this is not to be dismissed from a market perspective, even though it's not a big deal, as I said, and certainly politically in terms of Donald Trump's re-election prospects, which are, of course, the single most important issue on his agenda today. This is a win for him on top of getting the USMCA effectively signed off by the US Congress. So 2 deals in the space of just a few weeks for him, both broadly in line with his pre-election pledges in 2016, and therefore quite good news for him personally as well.
Okay, good point over there. So let me take it across to Michael Kugelman. Michael, you just heard Alastair saying, while it's good news, let's not get ahead of ourselves. It's a long expected lines. The impact is not going to be as massive, but would the impact be more on the sentiment? The very fact that Alastair is also talking about you can't expect bad news. It's a presidential election later this year in the United States.
Well, I would largely agree with Alastair's assessment. I mean, I have to admit that I am a bit surprised that we're having this deal emerge, even though it indeed is a watered-down deal. You know, the Trump administration has taken a consistently uncompromising position toward China, and you know, this is an administration that doesn't only consider China to be a strategic competitor or a strategic rival, as most recent previous U.S. presidents have, but this is an administration that has designated China as a national security threat of the highest order. And so to have for the administration to turn around and to come to an agreement on this deal, even though it certainly is not an ideal deal, I would describe it as a watered down one, that's quite striking. And also when you see this in the context of Trump's position on global trade on the whole, he's taken a very hard line, and particularly with the election, with this being an election year now, it is quite striking that he's agreed to a modest trade deal with a country that his administration describes as one of its not just large national security challenge, but a national security threat. And so, you know, final line on this, I would argue that this deal may perhaps be a good sign for prospects for the ongoing negotiations between the U.S. and India on their efforts to get a trade deal. Of course, the U.S. views India as a partner. It views China as a rival and a threat. So that suggests that perhaps good things could come after quite a few weeks of attempts to get a deal and many false starts. This could perhaps portend some good news on the U.S.-India trade front.
And you know, Alistair, both sides are saying they're going to remain in close communication. We don't have the details yet of what phase one is going to entail, and therefore we obviously have no idea what phase two is really going to have. But what we do know perhaps is that the planned escalation of tariffs is gone. Do you really believe that you could see a phase two of this trade deal before the US elections?
I'm really skeptical about that. I think that phase two will be significantly more difficult as a basis for agreement than phase one has been, assuming that the US does stick to its stated objectives vis-a-vis the role of the state in China's economy in particular. I simply can't see Xi Jinping going down that track far enough to satisfy the US. And I don't think we should assume that we have actually seen the final piece of market troubling news on trade from the Trump administration this year either. I mean, I broadly agree with everything which Michael said. I'm just a little bit more cautious about prospects for US India simply because Donald Trump has a track record of hitting allies and friendly countries fairly hard with trade measures as well. I'm not clear exactly where he personally stands on India, but I am clear, and in particular in the light of the statement which Robert Lighthizer made on Fox News just before Christmas, that Donald Trump is almost certainly going to go after the European Union on trade-related issues, as he's been threatening to for some time. Now, I don't think this is anything like as serious potentially as US-China trade, but it is nevertheless an issue out there which equity investors in particular perhaps will need to follow in the coming weeks, because the EU is not going to roll over. It is going to retaliate, and we are going to see individual products getting hit in both directions across the Atlantic. So let's not assume that we are at a total ceasefire on trade from the US, particularly given Donald Trump's propensity to want to use trade and other economic instruments to pursue non-trade and non-economic objectives, as we're seeing obviously big time in the case of Iran.
Okay, so let's actually ask Michael Kugelman this very question as well. You just heard what Alastair Newton had to say about Donald Trump and how he behaves with his allies. Let's look at the developments over the last couple of weeks. You know, when we saw that escalation with Iran, Donald Trump, tweeted about how he had information about General Soleimani being behind the attacks in Mumbai and New Delhi. India did not have a response on that. We heard Iran try to bring India into the equation as well. But India, stayed quiet through all of that. Do you think that could perhaps at all create a rift or a bumper of sorts between India and the US? Or, Donald Trump and his administration know that why should India have responded in the first place at all?
Well, I think India, of course, is in a very difficult position with this U.S.-Iran crisis. And of course, India is not the only country to be in a difficult position. It's in a difficult position because it needs to balance its very important relationship with the United States at the same time that it seeks to manage its important relationship with Iran, one which is significant for India for commercial reasons, but one that has been increasingly difficult to maintain due to the sanctions regimes that the Trump administration has implemented on Iran. But I do think that it's probably best for New Delhi, at least publicly, to remain relatively quiet and not to say all that much about this. I think that ideally, the de-escalatory signals that we've seen over the last 24 hours will remain in place for quite some time. Clearly, the spat between the U.S. and Iran is not over. But I think the best that you could hope for from the perspective of New Delhi is that it would simply encourage each side to the extent possible to exercise restraint. And I think that's a more reasonable position to take now than it might have been, 4 or 5 days ago, when it looked like this was a crisis that was going to escalate in a big way. And coming back to the negotiations, the trade negotiations between the U.S. and India, I don't think if India just tries to stay out and not get too involved in this dispute, that's not going to have any type of impact, any type of negative impact on the mood on the trend lines for the trade negotiations between the two. I think it's a completely separate matter. I mean, I don't think that the Trump administration expects India to be out there, out front, very publicly trying to give opinions on this whole Iran situation. I think that the U.S. has other countries in mind, quite frankly, but not necessarily India.
The reason I was asking is because both sides had invoked India, right? So, Alastair, let me come to you on that one. You did see Donald Trump invoke India. You saw the same situation being done by the Middle Eastern countries. But if I were to move on from that, this muddled ceasefire is the way a lot of the international media is describing it. Donald Trump has also made it very clear he doesn't need Middle Eastern oil. He's also going to resort to powerful higher sanctions against Iran. We don't know what they are as yet. That has not been revealed. How is that going to impact India?
I honestly don't think that India needs to worry too much about more sanctions against Iran. India is no longer buying oil from Iran, unlike China. At least India says it's not buying oil from Iran. I suspect there may be some black market oil slipping through somewhere, but officially there is an embargo on that. And I think we have to respect the Indian government's view on that. So they're out of the firing line on that. I think India actually has bigger things to worry about in the case of the Trump administration. And I would like to single out on that list actually what is going to continue to be a major issue between China and the US, and that is the technology war. There is no question in my mind other than that there is a very strong bipartisan agreement in Washington that China's technological aspirations pose an existential threat to US primacy. And a lot of countries are going to get caught in the middle of that because clearly China's 5G technology in particular is a very good price point. It's probably cutting edge relative to other countries' 5G technologies. And India is probably going to have to make some quite tough decisions as to where it is going to seek to acquire fairly advanced telecommunications and IT technologies generally, with China pushing very hard, of course, to market itself globally, particularly through Huawei, and America pushing back very strongly against that. Now, a couple of weeks ago, we saw America threaten some fairly tough sanctions to try to stop the completion of a mere gas pipeline between Russia and Germany, the Nord Stream 2, against an allied country, Germany. And I certainly would not rule out the US bringing in measures, economic measures against third countries looking to buy Chinese technology in general and Huawei technology in particular. I think in many respects, this is a bigger concern for India than US-Iran relations, unless we get something happening between US and Iran, which pushes the price of oil significantly higher when, of course, India as a big net energy importer is very vulnerable to rises in oil prices globally.
Of course, we did see the re-rating of all of those asset classes, didn't we, thanks to the escalation, and it will hurt India, which still imports 80% of the crude that is consumed here. So, Michael, while the United States can afford to flex its muscles and not worry about oil coming from the Middle East and turning out to be a net exporter, we don't really enjoy that luxury. But coming on what Alastair said, we have bigger problems that we need to fix. And having said that, Indo-China relations, of course, better than what they used to be, but nowhere close to what they ideally should be. So given the fact that US and China are trying to arrive at a truce, what's it going to mean for India and its foreign policy?
Well, I think it's a big question that's going to be it's going to play out only in the coming weeks and months. Just brief point on the Iran situation. I think it is very important to point out, as you just suggested, that indeed India is not really dependent on oil from Iran. It's reduced those imports because of U.S. sanctions. But the stakes for India of destabilizing outcomes and consequences in the coming months coming out of the assassination of Soleimani, very significant for India, as I see it, just because India is still remains so heavily dependent on hydrocarbons from the broader Middle East. You look at countries like Iraq, Saudi Arabia, other countries in the Gulf that India is dependent on for its energy imports. And also I think of the millions, I believe it's 8, 9 million Indian nationals that are based in that broader region. contributing in a big way to remittances and all that. So that suggests to me that India's economic interests are very much, I mean, they could be imperiled, they could be undercut if the dispute, the tensions between the U.S. and Iran continue to play out, and you continue to have reprisals. Again, we're in a de-escalatory period for now, but things could pick up a bit in the coming months. Very briefly, getting back to India's foreign policy, indeed, the relationship between India and China is very complicated. I think it is very striking that you have this announcement that India has allowed Huawei to come in and do some trials in India. I think that the U.S. should see that ideally strictly as a business decision, given that the telecom sector in India has really struggled over the last few months or so, and so there's no reason from a business perspective why it wouldn't want to at least try to engage with Huawei on a preliminary level. But the India-China relationship, it blows hot and cold, and I've always been a believer that the commercial aspects of that relationship keep it moving. And despite these long-standing, entrenched tensions from the border dispute to the Pakistan issue, I do think that the trade relations, even though they're quite imbalanced, not in India's favor, I think that those will persist and will enable this very complicated relationship to remain workable, despite all of the other problems. And so long as you have these periodic summits between the two leaders, that seems to inject new doses of goodwill as well from time to time.
So Michael, responding to what Alastair said about how India has bigger problems to fix, and he's used the H word, Huawei. So Alastair, let me come to you. The initial signal coming in from the Indian government that yes, Huawei can't pilot, it can test. It doesn't mean that it'll be allowed to, can cooperate with Indian telecom companies for 5G. If that were indeed to go through, that's something that the US administration is definitely going to frown upon. That's an educated guess, but a good one?
I think it's a very good guess indeed. The US, having started off after Huawei, 18 months ago now, has not really been particularly successful because it has been trying initially to act unilaterally. I think we all understand that the Trump administration has a strong propensity for unilateral action and is less inclined to work with allies on issues. However, they do seem to have learned some lessons from their early failure really to contain Huawei, and they are beginning to make progress with getting Huawei locked out of the markets of some allies. We've seen Australia and Japan in particular. They're now working on the Europeans. I'm pretty sure that India will come under diplomatic pressure initially, possibly coupled with threats downstream if there isn't the response which Washington is seeking, not to allow Huawei to go further than these trials, no matter how successful they may be. Given the very good point that's already been made about the Indian telecom sector struggling, given that there is nobody out there at the moment who can match Huawei on price and technological capability in 5G, I think India is going to have some pretty difficult decisions to make on this count.
Right, and with that, gentlemen, I'd like to thank you both for joining us here on this edition of the India Development Debate. We are going to see a high-level delegation from Beijing travel to Washington, D.C. Donald Trump has announced the phase 1 of the trade deal is going to be indeed signed. We don't know all the details as yet. As you heard both the panelists say, phase 2 looks very, very complex, very, very difficult. Is it even possible before the U.S. presidential elections?